the South attacked, the North mobilized, and the critical borderland between them erupted. Would Maryland secede and place the nation's capital in rebel country? Or would martial law and wholesale arrests control a people whose hearts were torn between the blue and the gray? There was a day that had no end. Its aftermath of suffering broke our hearts and stunned our minds. And still these men begged to become part of the fighting and to die in the cause of freedom. What was it like to live on a home front surrounded by the ebb and flow of armies? How did we define our feelings in poetry and diaries and letters? And how did the music, shared on both sides of the line, at last unite our hearts through song? Who can say when the Civil War really began? Was it a year and a half before Fort Sumter, October 1859, when John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry? Or did it actually begin centuries before, when the first slave ship docked in Annapolis, bringing Africans in chains to a region that would become the northernmost eastern slave state, the one closest to freedom? For many black men, women, and children of slavery, another sort of war started earlier, here on Maryland's eastern shore. This is a bean field now, but it was once worked by plantation slaves, slaves like Harriet Tubman, who in 1820 was born in a tiny cabin just on the edge of that tree line behind me. And it was Harriet Tubman, the slave, who escaped her bondage, fled north on the Underground Railroad, and later led almost 300 blacks to freedom. They called her Moses, and her deeds were battles in their own right. Long before the Civil War's first casualty fell, abolitionists seized the offensive. To counter the strict Fugitive Slave Acts of both 1793 and 1850, they set up routes of escape from south to north. It was the Underground Railroad, which in a span of 40 years or so helped free 50 to 100,000 slaves. There was no train, no lumbering locomotive, or tracks, stations, or conductors, not in the literal sense. It was instead a system of deliverance, demanding code names and stealth, desperate journeys north by moonlight, safe houses called stations, agents known as conductors, and their runaway guests, named passengers. The Underground Railroad was as rich in intrigue and drama, in life and death worry, as any modern-day spy thriller. Men and women, both black and white, ran it, although northern free blacks played the most important role in maintaining the railroad, all the while risking their lives in the quest for abolition. It was the likes of William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent anti-slavery agitator and the editor of The Liberator, who helped break slavery, and Lucretia Coffin Mott, a Quaker abolitionist and station keeper. There was Levi Coffin, reputed president of the railroad's thriving business in Indiana and Ohio. Frederick Douglass hid and led slaves through the Underground. And of course, there was William Still, perhaps the Underground Railroad's most persistent and tireless agent. History writes briefly about one of his most important contributions to abolition, for it was Still whom Harriet Tubman contacted in Philadelphia on her flight north from Maryland in 1849.
From a little child on up, she hated slavery, and she was right sassy around the people. When she was little, she used to take care of her mistress' baby, and if the baby cried, she'd get whipped. They didn't like her to work in the house, so they put her out in the fields. She was young then, too, but she would go out there and she would plow and plant and hoe, and she would pray every day, say, Lord, show me how to get free. So every day she prayed, every day she got a whipping. She just hated slavery. And her determination was to be free sometime, and she just prayed that the Lord would show her way.
This is Bucktown, or what's left of the Bucktown Harriet Tubman knew. On this corner stood the general store. She often came here with white overseers to buy soap, seed, food, ordinary things. But in 1849, Harriet Tubman did something on this corner that forever changed her life and history. While visiting the general store, Tubman was hit in the head with a 2-pound weight thrown by a plantation overseer at a slave Tubman was shielding. She almost died, but instead was prone to sleeping seizures for the rest of her life. It was a turning point, and coupled with the news soon after of her master's death, she was compelled to run. She most feared being sold to the Deep South. Her escape and eventual work in the underground is legendary. This most wonderful woman, as she was called by Susan B. Anthony, was known as a powerful and uncooperative slave, and an even more powerful underground leader. John Brown later called her General Tubman, and recalled she was the most man, naturally, that I ever met with. Runaways just called her Moses, the Deliverer. Tubman fled Dorchester County, north through Delaware, into Pennsylvania. It was there, in Philadelphia, she met William Still, who was a clerk in the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. A year later, Tubman began a career of conducting on the underground that took her back across the Mason-Dixon line 19 times. She led 300 men, women, and children, including her family, to safety in the North. She worked closely with abolitionists in Pennsylvania and Delaware and was an expert in the logistics of escape. She also carried a rifle or shotgun, not to protect herself, but to prevent panicked runaways from returning south.
It was $40,000 bounty on her head to be caught. But she was so shrewd they never caught her. She would, I don't know just how many she would have with her on each trip, but she wouldn't allow nobody to turn back. She said, you go forward and live, or you turn back and die. So she would carry that shotgun, and as you read in some of the stories, say she never lost a passenger, and she didn't.
No one knows how many slaves found freedom through the Underground Railroad. Whatever the number, it wasn't enough for the most radical abolitionists, like John Brown. A western Maryland farmhouse became the headquarters for an attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. The aim was to free not just a few slaves at a time, but all of them through armed insurrection. It failed. John Brown holed up in this building, but he was forced to surrender to U.S. Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee. After his trial, he said, I am now certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, except by blood. Bloodshed there certainly was. The political campaigns of the 1850s and 60s were marred by violence. Gangs, calling themselves plug uglies, rednecks, and even blood tubs, systematically intimidated voters. The caption on this 1858 cartoon says, Hello, redneck. Seen anything worth shooting up this way today? Nope. Nothing of any count worth speaking of. Some of the fellas winged a few Dutch, but I'm tired of shooting Dutch and Irish, I am. If I don't kill something else soon, I'll spile. Baltimore had a reputation for being a mob town and no stranger to violence. But by 1860, the whole region was torn by dissension. There were strong economic ties to both North and South, as well as emotional bonds of family and friendship across state lines in both directions. Most people wanted to preserve the Union, but still uphold the rights of Southerners to determine their own way of life. Further, there was a profound reluctance to become part of any use of force against the South. People in this middle region wanted to find a way to compromise the issues that were threatening to rip the fabric of the Republic. So, in the presidential election of 1860, John Bell, a pro-Union moderate from Tennessee, carried 47% of the Maryland vote outside of Baltimore. The city, however, along with Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore, went to John Breckinridge, a secessionist from Kentucky, who consequently carried the state by a small margin. The only clear result of the election was a vehement rejection of what folks called black republicanism. Abraham Lincoln got only 2.5% of the Maryland vote. Unfortunately, to get to Washington for his inauguration, the new president had to travel through Maryland. His staff, in response to rumors of an assassination plot in Baltimore, canceled his public appearances here and hustled him through, non-stop, in the middle of the night. Prompting sardonic jibes as to Abe's lack of courage. When Lincoln's election started the South on its course out of the Union, there was a strong possibility that Maryland would secede as well, leaving Washington, D.C. in rebel territory. In fact, the state legislature in 1860 passed a resolution to that effect. If the hour ever arrive when the Union must be dissolved, Maryland will cast her lot with her sister states of the South. After the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861, Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to put down the Confederate uprising. In the North, militia units gathered and began moving toward the nation's capital by train. That meant traveling through Baltimore. In the city, several rail lines met, but none went straight through. You had to change trains, and that meant using different train stations, coming into one station, crossing town, and leaving from another station. This is what's left of one of them, the President Street Station, a couple of blocks east of the Inner Harbor. On the morning of April 19, 1861, a train pulled into this station carrying a regiment from Massachusetts. They had to travel a mile or so west on Pratt Street to get to the Camden Station, where the B&O's line would take them the rest of the way to Washington.
Forward, march! Make way! Make way! Back! Stay back!
A crowd gathered. The troops were jeered and pelted with rocks. When it was over, 4 soldiers and 12 civilians were dead, and dozens had been injured. It was the first bloodshed of what was to become the Civil War. To keep that sort of thing from happening again, railroad bridges north of Baltimore were destroyed, and incoming troops had to turn back. Fearful that Baltimoreans would attack the Federal troops here at Fort McHenry, a junior officer threatened to train his guns on the Washington Monument. An official from the city told him, "If you do, there'll be nothing left of you but your brass buttons to tell who you were." To get things under control, Lincoln sent this man into the state, General Benjamin F. Butler, sometimes known as Beast Butler. He brought troops in by water and stationed them around Annapolis. He repaired the railroad tracks and bridges and put them under guard. He surrounded Baltimore with army camps and turned Federal Hill into a fort with enough cannon power to rake 3/4 of the town. Caches of weapons were found, apparently stashed for shipment to the South. In a building behind City Hall, officers discovered cannons, gun carriages, and 1/2 ton of assorted shot. Fearful of an attack to regain the weapons, The Federals set up a battery to guard them. Full martial law was imposed, with a suspension of the right of habeas corpus. This allowed the military to seize and hold indefinitely anyone suspected of disloyalty to the Union. Even Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney of Dred Scott decision fame was horrified and reproached Lincoln for this violation of the rights of American citizens. Though fearful of his own arrest, Taney, at age 84, felt impelled to protest. "I am an old man, a very old man, but perhaps I was preserved for this occasion. The people of the United States are no longer living under a government of laws, but every citizen holds life, liberty, and property at the will and pleasure of the army officer in whose military district he may happen to be found." Taney's protest had no effect. The searches and seizures continued, many of them carried out in the middle of the night, and some with considerable violence. The Pratt Street riot and the military control that followed moved James Ryder Randall to a poetic protest.
The despot still lives on thy shore, Maryland, my Maryland. His touch is at thy temple door, Maryland, my Maryland. Avenge the patriotic gore that flecked the streets of Baltimore, and be the battle queen of yore, Maryland.
Randall's song, which became second only to Dixie in popularity in the South, urged the poet's home state to secede. It didn't, but many Marylanders did. Thousands slipped across the Potomac and formed units, so several of the war's battles had Maryland companies facing one another on opposite sides of the firing line. Civic leaders suspected of Confederate sympathies were held here at Fort McHenry. Among them, several judges and newspaper editors, 4 of Baltimore's police commissioners, Mayor Brown and Marshal Kane, the 2 men who stood between the soldiers and the mob during the riot on Pratt Street, and 26 members of the state legislature. One of the newspaper editors, taken from his home and brought here in the middle of the night, was a man named Frank Key Howard. He left an account of his experience. The rooms were in the second story of the building and opened upon a narrow balcony which we were allowed to use. When I looked out in the morning, I could not help being struck by an odd and not pleasant coincidence. On that day, 47 years before, my grandfather, Mr. F.S. Key, then a prisoner on a British ship, had witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry. When on the following morning the hostile fleet drew off, defeated, he wrote the song so long popular throughout the country, the Star-Spangled Banner. As I stood upon the very scene of that conflict, I could not but contrast my position with his 47 years before. The flag, which he had then so proudly hailed, I saw waving at the same place over the victims of as vulgar and brutal a despotism as modern times have witnessed. Outside the Star Fort's walls, the grounds became an army camp. Prisoners considered very dangerous, and those under a sentence of death, were kept in dungeon-like cells across the way. One of these men was a Marylander named Henry Brogdon. He'd joined the Confederacy and rose to officer rank. Then he was caught behind enemy lines and brought here under a sentence of death as a spy. He spent 6 months in a cell 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. There is no bedstead or chair, there being no room for such luxuries. I am allowed a mattress, which I place on the damp floor at night and stand up on end against the wall in the day. I am not allowed bed linen. At no time are the walls of my cell dry, the rear wall particularly. Moisture trickles down it the whole time, and I can fill my hand with a green slime simply by passing it up the face of the wall. Eventually, Brogdon was exchanged for a Union prisoner, but later he said, "I went into the cell as a boy. I came out a gray-haired man with lifelong experience." To this day, some of these guns still aim at Baltimore. And of course, James Ryder Randall's Confederate anthem remains the official Maryland state song. But Baltimore and Annapolis weren't the only towns to suffer during the war. The Eastern Shore felt the impact of martial law as well. In Easton, a judge named Richard Bennett Carmichael was accused of making inflammatory and insulting remarks. Federal troops entered his courtroom and dragged him from the bench. When he fought back, he was pistol whipped and jailed for 6 months. No charges were ever placed against him. To the west, however, it was not martial law, but the war itself that brought suffering. The region became one of the crucial battlegrounds. Along the Potomac River, Union troops maintained patrols against the constant incursions of the Confederates. The primary target was the town where John Brown had tried to start it all, Harper's Ferry. This spectacular gap where 2 rivers meet became the most hotly contested piece of real estate in the country. It changed hands repeatedly. During one such exchange, Stonewall Jackson placed cannons up on the surrounding cliffs, fired down upon the Union encampment, and forced the surrender of thousands of Northern troops. North and east of here, towns were occupied and held for ransom. Middletown had to pay the Confederates $5,000, Hagerstown $20,000, and Frederick a whopping $200,000. In addition, the rebels requisitioned whatever supplies they could lay hand to. Sometimes they paid, in Confederate money, of course, but most of the time they simply helped themselves.
For our liberty with treasure, blood, and toil, and when our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far, hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. Hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah. Hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star.
And through all that, the baffling, incomprehensible pain of our inner conflicts persisted. Our divisions cut across not simply the map of the region, not north versus south, or eastern shore versus the west, but family against family, and within families, brother against brother, and son against father. The poet Lisette Woodworth-Reese was a young girl living north of Baltimore during the war. Her family embodied the conflict common to many others. Her grandfather was a passionate secessionist. One of his sons joined the Union Army. One daughter married a Southern sympathizer, and another married an abolitionist. Lisette said, "Between the blue forces and the gray, we were ground between 2 millstones of terror." This town, Union Mills, was almost completely inhabited by a single clan, the Shrivers. One branch of the family owned slaves, but they were pro-Union. Another branch owned no slaves, but had 6 sons join the Confederate forces. These differing devotions came out on a day in June 1863 as the armies were converging on Gettysburg. Jeb Stuart's cavalry came through town first and were fed an immense pancake breakfast. The Southern sympathizing branch of the family even sang Stuart's favorite song, "If you want to be a bully boy, join the cavalry." A few hours later, Union troops paused at the home of the slave-owning Shrivers and were treated to a picnic lunch and a song fest at the family piano. Not all the encounters between troops and townfolk ended in two-part harmony. As the war ground on, year upon year, raids became bitterly destructive. In some towns, people shut their doors and windows to both sides. At other times, especially after a battle, folks opened their churches, their barns, their homes, and their hearts to the wounded, all divisions melting in the warmth of an unspeakable pity. Sharpsburg, Maryland, a quiet farming community of about 900 residents, comfortably nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Pacifist German Baptists settled here in 1763. They quickly turned this land into one of the most productive areas of the state. They never imagined their descendants would witness the bloodiest single day of American history. The Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. The newly formed Union Army of the Potomac and the veteran Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, both believing God was on their side. Both commanding generals convinced this battle would end the war and decide the fate of their nation. Lee needed a decisive victory which would earn the confidence of Europe and force the Union to sue for peace. McClellan hoped to crush the Confederate Army, end the war, retire a hero. September 15th, the armies advanced upon Sharpsburg. Confederate commands under Generals Stuart, Longstreet, and D.H. Hill crossed Antietam Creek after valiantly holding South Mountain against the massive Union Army. Lee's engineering skills convinced him the hills and fields of Sharpsburg made for an ideal defense. At Harper's Ferry, Jackson left a division under A.P. Hill to finish the formalities of surrender and oversee loading the captured munitions for transport to Richmond. Jackson, Walker, and McLaws briskly marched their divisions back toward Sharpsburg. McClellan desperately wanted a view of his enemy. Did Lee outnumber him? Did he retreat back into Virginia after South Mountain? McClellan couldn't be sure. Stuart's cavalry constantly thwarted his best scouts' efforts. By mid-afternoon, Captain George Armstrong Custer, McClellan's staff aide and reconnaissance officer, made this report.
The enemy is drawn up in line of battle on a ridge west and behind Antietam Creek. They are in full view. Their line is a perfect one, about 1.5 miles long. Longstreet is in command and has 40 cannon that we know of.
So the enemy had not skedaddled at all. Instead, he regrouped his forces to stand and fight. Victory was not complete, yet. Nearly 100,000 soldiers and officers converged upon the homes and farms of this tiny town. Thousands of horses pulled supply wagons and cannons. Signal Corps officers strung miles of telegraph lines from trees and rooftops. A mighty battle would soon erupt. The frightened townsfolk fled, seeking the safety of neighbors' cellars and nearby caves. Dawn, Tuesday, September 16th. Hidden by a dense fog, Jackson and Walker's divisions made their way into Sharpsburg. McLaw's men, after a late start from Harper's Ferry, would not arrive until the next morning. Neither side could see the other. Tensions ran high from Washington to Richmond. Communication was erratic between the battle lines and the capitals. Both presidents wanted to know details. The whole country hung in suspense. The civilized world watched and waited. This confrontation would decide the fate of America. McClellan would launch his attack Wednesday, September 17th. The battle took place in 3 main phases. The first, or morning phase took place at dawn with Hooker's attack on the Confederate left, beyond in the North Woods, and here in Miller's cornfield. Deadly artillery fire rained upon both sides. The Confederate rifle fire was so accurate that Hooker wrote, "Every stalk of corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows precisely as they had stood moments before." The second, or midday phase, concentrated against the Confederate center along this time-worn, sunken road. A natural trench, it foretold events to come in this modern war. Hidden from view, Confederate soldiers mowed down the unsuspecting Union columns. The use of trenches became a standard defense tactic. Within 4 hours, the field was a blue sea of Union bodies, and Confederate dead lay 3 deep in the bloody lane. The third and final phase of this day, which never seemed to end, started here at the Confederate right, across this bridge known as Burnside Bridge. From the heights above, nearly 500 Georgia riflemen held off thousands of Union troops under General Burnside's command. Company upon company struggled to cross the bridge as their comrades fell beside them. By nightfall, as the day's furor came to an end, 3,900 Americans lay dead on the fields and roads of Sharpsburg. Another 18,300 fell wounded and dying, waiting for help. 2,100 men simply disappeared, missing in action. Sharpsburg lay in ruins. Families lost their homes and businesses. Lawsuits against the federal government for property damages would go unresolved for decades. This gentle little town, once offered as a site for the nation's capital in 1790, would never be the same. The nation paid men and boys to go to war, but left the cost of their burial to their friends and families. Morticians used the Dunkard Church as an embalming station, preparing soldiers' bodies for their final trip home. Most of the dead, however, were buried where they fell. By the end of the war, the legislatures of the northern states raised money to exhume the dead and bury them in a place of honor. Antietam National Cemetery was dedicated September 17, 1867, 5 years after the battle. Originally intended for the victims of both sides, the cemetery held only the remains of Union soldiers. Several states had threatened to withdraw their funds if the cemetery included rebels. The Confederate dead remained in the fields of Sharpsburg, their skeletons dug up by dogs and picked at by chickens. Finally, in 1870, the Maryland legislature passed a bill providing funds for the decent burial of Confederate soldiers. 7 years later, Washington Cemetery, near Hagerstown, became the final resting place for the fallen soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia. The Battle of Antietam claimed more than lives. It shattered illusions. Until Antietam, most Americans witnessed the war through idealized paintings and illustrations. Photographers never entered a battlefield before the scars of war had been removed. Entrepreneur Matthew Brady sent his best photographers, Alexander Gardner and James Gibson, to travel with the Army of the Potomac. Within 2 days of the battle, they began their studies of the dead. On October 20th, 1862, Brady opened the Antietam exhibit at his gallery in New York. A Times reporter described the effect as America beheld the carnage of war. The living that throng Broadway care little, perhaps, for the dead at Antietam. As it is, the dead of the battlefield come to us very rarely, even in dreams. We see the list in the morning paper at breakfast, but dismiss its recollection with the coffee. Each of these little names that the printer struck off so lightly last night, whistling over his work, and that we speak of with a clip of the tongue, represents a bleeding, mangled corpse. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. But there is one side of the picture that the sun did not catch, one phase that has escaped photographic skill. It is the background of widows and orphans, torn from the bosom of their natural protectors by the red, remorseless hand of battle. Homes have been made desolate, and the light of life in thousands of hearts has been quenched forever. All of this desolation, imagination must paint. Broken hearts cannot be photographed.
If I'm numbered with the slain.
Over 21,000 men lay dead or dying on the fields of Antietam. The wounded were taken to many area farms and barns like this one, Piper's Barn, which had been converted to makeshift field hospitals. For the wounded, the Civil War hospital would be a grim and disheartening place. Medical knowledge and resources available before the Battle of Antietam were meager. The medical corps for both North and South were in chaos, not prepared for the task of caring for thousands of mangled and suffering men. The Federal Army only had about 100 medical officers, the Confederacy about 25. Although volunteer doctors would join their ranks, both medical staffs would remain undermanned, underqualified, and under-equipped. The field hospital was normally located beyond the range of enemy artillery, so the first problem facing the Army hospital staff was getting the wounded from the battlefield. There were no trained personnel to do this task, the wounded being left for their comrades to carry them off. Consequently, many wounded would lie on the battlefield for days, waiting to be taken to the nearest aid station. Many would die waiting. Once the wounded reached the tent or barn that served as the field hospital, they were quickly divided into three categories. Those men about to die were made as comfortable as possible, then left alone. Men with minor wounds were treated by a dressing surgeon. The surgical cases had to await their turn on the operating table. Again, many more would die just waiting. Of the thousands of soldiers wounded in battle, 94% of the wounds were by bullets. Most of the Army doctors were general practitioners and knew very little about treating battle wounds. Although the doctors were called surgeons, very few had ever performed surgery. Dr. William Slaughter Adams, a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Medicine, was at Antietam and kept a detailed account of the men he treated. Of the 46 Union soldiers he tended, only 11 recovered from their wounds and surgery. About 1 man in 3 would not survive the field hospital. Those that did frequently had complications arise later from infection or improperly performed surgical procedures. For thousands, surgery meant amputation, literally done in a few minutes. Amputation was the quickest and easiest solution to wounds that shattered bones. 3 out of 4 battlefield operations performed during the war were amputations, provoking bitter criticisms and repeated references to field surgeons as butchers. For the Federal troops, just under 30,000 amputations were performed. Nearly 75% survived. Less complete data for the Confederacy indicate similar figures.
Stretcher bear.
Most who survived the field hospital still faced a long period of recovery and were moved as soon as possible to the general hospitals located in cities near the war zones. Early in the war, such hospitals simply did not exist, nor were they contemplated. The wounded from the early battles were housed in converted schools, hotels, factories, railroad stations, and private homes. But in a remarkably short period of time, both North and South had constructed a network of hospitals of astonishing size and efficiency. By war's end, the Union Army was operating 204 general hospitals, averaging more than 500 beds each. In the South, roughly 150 general hospitals were built east of the Mississippi. 49 sprang up in Richmond alone. The Battle of Antietam spurred the Federal use of Baltimore as a major hospital center. Army hospitals were located at Camps McClellan, Patterson Park, and Stewart Mansion. Also, several warehouses, churches, and hotels, including the National Hotel in Camden Station, were converted into hospitals. But for all their resources, the general hospitals were breeding grounds of disease. Here, infections known as surgical fevers took their toll. Chief among them was blood poisoning. Over 97% of those afflicted by it died. Of the approximately 620,000 men who perished in the war, more than 2/3 would die from disease. After Antietam, Civil War medicine began to improve. One chief improvement was in the quality of nursing. A wounded man might see a doctor once a day. Any other human comfort came from his ward mates or the nursing staff. At first, nursing duties were assigned to convalescent or non-combat soldiers who were usually not suited or trained for the job. Despite the well-known achievements of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, it was generally improper for women to work in hospitals. Cynics claimed that women would faint at the sight of blood and disturb the wounded with their hysterics. But sheer necessity soon put an end to such notions. For lack of anyone else to do the job, women were not only admitted to the wards and battlefields, but actively recruited. Women revolutionized the care of the sick and wounded. Female nurses bandaged, gave medicine, washed, cooked, read, sang, wrote letters, and prayed. A number of women won national attention for their efforts. Dorothea Dix, already widely known for her work in reforming prisons and insane asylums, became, at the age of 60, head of the nursing service in the Union Army hospitals. Writer Louisa May Alcott wrote about her experiences working in a general hospital in Washington, D.C. Few women actually served at the scene of battle, but occasionally an angel of mercy did appear amidst the turmoil. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, gained worldwide fame for tending the wounded at Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg. There were Southern women in the field, too. The most famous nurse in the South was Sally Louisa Tompkins, who so impressed Jefferson Davis with her hard work and sacrifice that he commissioned her a captain in the Confederate service, making her the South's only female officer to emerge from the war. And there were a host of unknown battlefield angels. One Angela Kirkham Davis of Funkstown, Maryland, organized a group of ladies from her community to help nurse the wounded at Antietam. In an unpublished journal, she wrote of what she saw at one field hospital.
As we stepped out of our carriage, a ghastly, gruesome sight met our gaze. About 2,000 pallid, death-like looking men, mangled, bleeding, and torn, were lying all around on the ground. A horrible and sickening scene to behold, such as I never wish to see again.
Another medical improvement was the creation of the Sanitary Commission. Similar to a modern Red Cross or USO, the Sanitary Commission became the right arm of the Union Hospital and Medical Services. There were few facets of the war which the Commission did not have a hand in. It recruited nurses for Army hospitals, provided bandages, medicines, and food to supplement the highly inadequate hospital rations. The Commission campaigned against scurvy and for better sanitation in Army camps. It established and maintained hospital ships, relief camps, and convalescent homes. And the Commission helped the wounded making their painful way back home and aided frantic relatives in locating those missing in action. These activities and the money needed to carry them out owed their existence to a multitude of anonymous women who ran countless bazaars and fundraising programs that were unparalleled up to that time. More medical improvements saw the creation of an ambulance corps with men trained to care for the wounded. Medical wagons started to carry a prescribed list of medicinal supplies. Surgeons were required to keep medical records on all patients. Army medical schools and hospitals were established, as well as improvements made in the field of dentistry and pharmacy. So at first glance it would appear that the Civil War brought forth little more than hundreds of unsanitary hospitals and thousands of botched amputations. But the war between the states brought forth a medical revolution, and perhaps above all, an awareness of public health. The Union's victory at Antietam would change the course of the war and affect forever the very fabric of American society. 18 months prior to Antietam, when the first call for Union volunteers was issued, blacks, both slave and free, were among the first to offer their services as soldiers. And as in previous wars, their offers were at first rejected.
I was refused. The officers claim they don't care to have at this time any colored soldiers. A month or so ago, I was at Utah Street and saw an old friend. He gave me a handbill. It was about an anti-slavery society meeting to be held at his church. I went, and there the minister was reading from a speech by Frederick Douglass. I've read Douglass's words many times and have been deeply moved. Douglass wanted the opportunity for those of us colored citizens to fight in this war. And so when the call came, I came here to the recruiting office and was told the Army had no intention of employing colored soldiers. There will come a time when the Army will want all of its soldiers to put down this great war between the states. And I will be back.
Maryland at the start of the war was caught in the middle, with its Southern sympathies and Northern ties. She was a state divided. Maryland's black population, 170,000 in total, was also divided, with an almost equal number of free blacks and slaves. Preservation of the Union, and not the abolition of slavery, was Abraham Lincoln's first priority, as shown in his inaugural speech.
I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Those who nominated and elected me did so with full knowledge that I made this and many similar declarations, and had never recanted them.
Coming for to carry me home.
Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass provided a powerful voice in the anti-slavery movement even before the first guns were fired.
If we ever get free from all the oppressions and wrongs heaped upon us, we must pay for their removal. We must do this by labor, by suffering, by sacrifice, and, if need be, by our lives and the lives of others.
Born a Maryland slave, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was sold several times. He eventually escaped and fled north, where he was befriended by white abolitionists. He changed his name from Bailey to Douglass so he could avoid the slave catchers. And in 1845, he published an account of his bondage.
I was born in Tuckahoe, in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. My father was a white man. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant. It was common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away. I have had two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. He was a cruel man, hardened by the long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. Where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to hell of slavery through which I was about to pass.
Before the Civil War, Frederick Douglass would write the book My Bondage, My Freedom, lecture throughout the North for the Anti-Slavery Society, and write editorials for the North Star, all in the fervent hope of eradicating the evil institution of slavery. At the beginning of this conflict, Douglass and other abolitionists would urge President Lincoln to free all slaves and endorse the enlistment of colored troops. Reluctantly, the President would act upon their advice in the fall of '62. Mounting casualties, possible European intervention, a year and a half of bloody devastation with no final Northern victory in sight. President Lincoln realized stronger measures were needed against the rebellious Confederate states. 4 days after the costly bloodshed at Antietam, Lincoln issued a draft of a proclamation that would free slaves only in the fractious southern states, but not in the border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, or Maryland, which were being held by Union forces. Maryland would not abolish slavery until 1864. Lincoln ruminated about the effect this Emancipation Proclamation would have on this young, blood-stained country.
We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility in giving freedom to the slave. We assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose that last best hope of earth.
By issuing the draft in the fall of '62, President Lincoln had hoped to bring some of the seditious states back into the Union. He also hoped to prevent the intervention of the Europeans, whose textile economy was tied to the cotton industry of the South. By changing the focus of the war from one about individual states' rights to one concerning human rights, Lincoln successfully prevented European interference. No Southern states, however, re-entered the Union until the end of the war.
The chariot's coming, good news. The chariot's coming, and I don't want to leave me behind.
Within 3 months of the Emancipation Proclamation, Maryland organized 6 regiments of colored volunteers made up of slaves and free blacks. The 4th, 7th, 9th, 19th, 30th, and 39th Infantry Regiments. When Maryland slaveholders protested the recruitment of their slaves, a legislative compromise was enacted, whereby an owner who recorded manumission of the slave would receive $100 from the federal government. Throughout the state, as well as the country, black recruitment accelerated.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, recruiters were soon singing a different tune. I was able to enlist finally in the Army in Baltimore. In Maryland, there would be 6 regiments that would be made up of black soldiers. The 4th Regiment, United States Colored Troops, was recruited, drilled, and then sent off almost immediately to fight.
Carry this musket, and we've been teaching you how to do it for 3 months. We're going to see if you know how to do it by now.
Over 8,000 black Marylanders would serve in the Union forces by war's end. The colored regiments of Maryland would participate in every military theater, from guarding Confederate prisoners at Point Lookout to the last battle of the war. They would fight with courage and distinction. Major General Birney remarked, "To the colored troops recently added to us and fighting with us, the General tenders his thanks for their uniform good conduct and soldierly bearing." A New York war correspondent also remarked about the same troop. The 7th U.S. Colored Troops of Maryland on the first day carried fixed bayonets, a line of rifle pits, and carried it without a shot, but with a loss of 35. It was one of the most stirring and gallant affairs I have ever known.
We fought at places with names like Yorktown, Deep Bottom, Dutch Gap, Fort Harrison, Newmarket Heights, and Petersburg. fighting at the crater was very intense, and we saw acts of bravery and heroism that were unbelievable. Shoulder to shoulder stood black soldiers, some free, some ex-slave, together fighting for their manhood and for freedom for themselves, their friends, their family, and their race.
Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, a free Baltimorean of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops, would be one of 20 black soldiers and sailors awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in this war between the states.
Today, the regiment stands before Richmond. As the war comes to a close, we hope and pray that this country for which we have laid down our lives will treat us as citizens in peace as they have soldiers in war.
While Union infantry, cavalry, and artillery units would be segregated, the Navy would not. The Navy welcomed colored sailors, most of whom came from the oyster fleets of the Chesapeake Bay. But by the spring of 1865, more than 200,000 blacks, mostly ex-slaves, would serve in the Union Army and Navy. The price of freedom for almost 4 million slaves came high, the cost in lives heavy. Over 38,000 blacks lost their lives for this valiant cause.
We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future.
It's been over 125 years since the last guns were fired in the bloodiest war on American soil. Was the freedom so dearly fought for worth the cost? Perhaps the words of Reinhold Niebuhr express it best. Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. What was it like to live in a border state during the Civil War? In 1860, the population of Maryland was just under 600,000. Baltimore, with 212,000 people, was the third largest city in the nation and very big in manufacturing and trade. Some 1,500 ships did business here, 300 of them in oysters. If you were working in the shipyards, say as a ship's caulker, you'd make a whopping $2.75 a day. Farther west in the coal mines, you'd work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Out of your pay, they'd take deductions for everything from the use of the tools to the company school for children too young to go to work, and so your income would come to a little over $400 a year. An unskilled worker in a place like the arms factory at Harper's Ferry could earn $1 a day. A skilled machinist, though, got more than double that. About a fifth of the workforce was women, and naturally they earned less. Before the sewing machine came into use, it would take 14 hours to make a man's shirt. With the new invention, you could do the work in only 1 hour and get paid 15 cents for the job. You could buy a very modest home for around $300. To rent it might cost $5 or $10 a month. The parlor reflected the family's interests: pictures, newspapers, music, and correspondence. If you lived in 1860, you'd probably spend a lot of time writing letters. Of course, there were no automobiles, so if you wanted to go for a ride, you'd roll out your velocipede, or probably just walk. At the general store, you'd find everything from oysters to tobacco. A man named Borden had developed canned goods, but as the war dragged on, fresh produce grew scarce and prices rose. Butter went from 50 cents a pound to $1, but porterhouse steak, if you could get it, remained at 30 cents a pound.
Now that mail is moving once again.
Here's your silk, ladies. I think you will find it suits your needs.
And the stationery?
The
Perhaps that also? Oh,
only the
wonderful.
finest. Of course, the silk has gone up in price, ladies. You know it's up to $2.50 a yard, do you not?
Since the time we ordered it?
Yes, ma'am.
But of course, that wasn't the worst part of life during the war in a border region. Martial law not only put secessionists in jail, it put ordinary folk in jeopardy as well. The freedoms we take for granted, like freedom of speech, press, and assembly, were suddenly removed. There was a curfew, too. Stores had to close at 5 p.m., taverns and restaurants at 8, and nobody was allowed on the streets after 10. Even in the daytime, you had to watch your step. Infractions of the rules brought fines.
My name is George Lemon. Gosh, I got myself caught this time. The judge charged me $1 and court cost for racing my horse and buggy down the street.
When the Confederate prisoners passed by, my heart just went out to them, so I shouted, "Hurrah for Jeff Davis!" It cost me a $5 fine, but I'd do it again if I had another $5.
You couldn't cheer or even greet the Confederate prisoners passing through town. And wearing the colors of the rebel flag could get you jailed. And of course, you had better not whistle Dixie. The Civil War. Even the name stirs our imagination, doesn't it? We think of a nation divided, of political motivations, battles, strategies, attacks, defeats. And just as relevant as the volumes of facts was the outpouring of letters, journals, and diaries, poetry and music reflecting the spirit of the time. In July 1861, a Virginia soldier noted that everybody is writing who can raise a pencil and a sheet of paper. The soldiers wrote out of love and homesickness, the desire to keep in touch with the families and loved ones they had left behind, the need to reflect on the new and dangerous adventure they had become a part of, and to reflect on themselves, their courage, and the commitment they had made to their cause. The poets and musicians recorded the mood of the people, and although the first shots fired at Fort Sumter cut the nation in half, music lent the North and the South a spiritual oneness. On the battlefront, soldiers marched and fought and recorded their events and feelings. On the home front, men spoke out, women kept journals and gossiped, and soon somebody started to sing out the news. General Robert E. Lee was quoted as saying, "Without music, we couldn't have any army." And he was probably right. The Civil War was known as one of the great singing wars of all time. During the war, the North and South borrowed songs from each other and used them for the cause of freedom as each saw it at the time. Copyrights were ignored, and parody and satire were devices used by both sides. Soldiers sang in campsites, on the march, and sometimes they even sang together from their respective positions on the battlefields. From the South's patriotic Dixie, Bonnie Blue Flag, and Maryland, My Maryland, to tenting on the old campground, and Lorena, to the North's Battle Hymn of the Republic, and May God Save the Union, to Tramp, 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 Ora Lee, and Just Before the Battle, Mother. The music inspired and soothed the people through a troubled time.
I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, the battle queen of yore, Maryland, my Maryland. We are a band of brothers and native to the soil, fighting for our liberty with treasure, blood, and toil. And when our rights were threatened, the cry rose near and far, hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star. Hurrah, hurrah, for Southern rights, hurrah. Hurrah for the bonny blue flag that bears a single star.
The years creep slowly by, Lorena. The snow is on the grass again. The sun's low down the sky, Lorena. The frost gleams where the flowers have been, but the heart throbs on as warmly now as when the summer days were nigh. Oh, the sun can never dip so low adown affection's cloudless sky.
My dear Ma, I received your kind and affectionate letter day before yesterday. I was very anxious to hear from home and to know how you were getting along. I expect it is right lonely since Jack and I left. I never get lonesome here, surrounded by about 4,000 men of all kinds. Everything moves as regularly here as if moved by machinery. The drum beats at 5 to get up. At 10 minutes after, the roll is called. At 6, the drill begins, ends at 7, and breakfast at 8. Drill at 9, ends at 10, commences again at 11, and ends at 12. Dinner at 1, and then we have a recess until 3, when drill commences again and ends at 4. Write soon. Tell me everything that is going on in the neighborhood. Yours affectionately, William.
June 1863. One thing of importance which I recall in connection with our last fight was the matter of shoes and socks and a change of shirts and underclothing. A lot of Union supplies were left behind, and we boys of the 2nd Maryland all got a couple of changes of underclothing, socks, and shirts. I can remember that we had an opportunity to get outer clothing, such as pants and coats, but some of us were not so reduced as others and had a sort of aversion to putting on blue jackets or pants. And when I started out of Winchester for the further march northward, I can remember that I had on new shoes and new socks, new underclothing, and a full change in my haversack. I think we must have crossed the Potomac about June 20th and proceeded as far as Hagerstown, where we were halted for a few days until other divisions of Ewell's Corps came up and joined us. I remember that a lot of us boys wrote to our Eastern Shore home folks while we were stopped at Hagerstown and left the letters for some of the citizens to mail out for us.
With its cloud of skirmishers in advance, with now the sound of a single shot snapping like a whip, and now an irregular volley, the swarming ranks press on and on. The dense brigades press on, glittering dimly, toiling under the sun. The dust-covered men in columns rise and fall to the undulations of the ground, with artillery interspersed. The wheels rumble, the horses sweat, as the Army Corps advances. Walt Whitman.
July 11th, 1863. My dearest wife, I write about our first crossing of the Potomac. We marched reasonably along through Hagerstown, Middleburg, Chambersburg, and thence to Gettysburg, where we first met the enemy, 1.5 miles before reaching the city. On the 1st of July, Hill met the enemy, fought and whipped him, driving him 2 miles beyond Gettysburg. The next night and day, Ewell swung around southeast, marching towards Gettysburg, and we moved to the right of Hill, all the army being in line of battle by noon of the 2nd. About noon, the cannonading began, and at 2 p.m., we were ordered to advance with the infantry. We fought for half an hour or more and drove the enemy for half a mile perhaps, and during my experience, I have never seen so much damage done both parties in so short space of time. I had 18 men killed, several mortally wounded, and about 100 more or less wounded. My regiment suffered about as much as the other regiments in the brigade. During the fight of the 2 days, we captured about 11,000 prisoners. On the morning of the 3rd, General Lee ordered General Pickett to attack the most vulnerable portion of the enemy's line, while he shelled their entire line with artillery. We opened 175 cannons at one time, and the enemy replied with perhaps half as many. Hundreds, if not thousands, of the enemy were killed and wounded. During the 4th, everything was comparatively quiet except a cavalry fight on our right. About 10 p.m., we got orders to march. We all arrived near Hagerstown on Tuesday and have been here since. What we are to do next, no one but General Lee can tell. I don't know when I can write you again. I'll write as soon as I can, at any rate, if I'm spared. If I should be taken off in the next battle, I can only say I hope to meet you and mine in heaven. Kiss our dear little pets for me. Give love to all the connections at home. And take for yourself my whole heart. Goodbye, my dearest pet. Your devoted husband.
June, 1864. The morning of June 3rd was so thick with fog that we could not see 100 yards in front of where we lay. I remember that it became fearfully black and dark, this in addition to the fog, making the moment one of the most nerve-wracking tenseness. The first thing we knew, there loomed up in our very faces what seemed to be just a solid mass of black form. It was the enemy, and they were actually not 100 feet from where our line lay crouching on the ground. I never heard any order to fire. We must every man of us at the same moment recognize the United States flag, and I can recall that 100 of us must have yelled in one breath, "It's the Yankees!" Then simultaneously with that yell, every musket in Finnegan's division rang out, and the dark wave could no longer be distinguished in our front. We must have waited fully 20 minutes, and the same thing happened again. We fired in the same fashion as the first time, and they again broke. Then the fog lifted somewhat, and it is no longer dark, but broad daylight. They were coming for the third time at our line. We poured our fire into their ranks, and as they broke, we charged them. The dead and wounded of the enemy were scattered and piled so thickly that it was difficult for us to get through without stepping upon their bodies. In an hour from the time that the first attack was made, we drove back 10 times our own number. A force of less than 1,000 men had either killed, wounded, or captured 10,000 of the enemy.
November 1864. In a few days we were started on our way to City Point, through line after line of the Federal Army. Then it was that I got my first real impression of the strength and size of the enemy's forces. What a contrast in men and army equipment to the thin and ragged line of my comrades who had been holding this vast army in check through that hot and fearful summer and fall. At City Point, nothing but army encampments and soldiers, miles and miles of tented fields. Some 20 or 30 of us ragged prisoners were placed under guard on a hill, where we were held for 2 or 3 days. We were taken by boat to Point Lookout. The whole lot of us were marched to the receiving quarters, where we were searched and registered. I remember that I was allowed to keep a small pocket knife, the man handing it back to me with the remark that he didn't think it big enough for me to kill a Yank with. In the stockade enclosure, I was informed that there were approximately 20,000 Confederate prisoners.
April 1865. At last the end came at Appomattox on the 9th of April. Our little remnant of the 2nd Maryland, 62 officers and men under the gallant Captain Torsch, stacked our arms, furled our colors, and obeying the last order of our idolized Robert E. Lee, surrendered. We kept our morale and offered a firm front to the enemy to the very last. We never flinched. We never quailed. We never failed in spirit or discipline. No fatigue or hardship had overcome our endurance. No danger had appalled us. As we had been from the beginning, so we continued to the end, brave, resolute, intrepid.
Those who put their faith and trust in the Union were no less passionate. Federal regiments mailed hundreds of letters each day, penning messages of love and hope, death, fatigue and weariness, and a great determination to win. The soldiers' inspiration and desire carried over into their music as well.
Yes, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor, up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
When the blackbird in the spring on the willow tree sat and rocked, I heard him sing, singing glory. Orally, made of golden hair, sunshine came along with thee, and swallows in the air. Trap, 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 the boys are marching. Cheer up, comrades, they will come. And beneath the starry flag, we shall breathe the air again of the free land in our own beloved home.
July 22nd, 1861. As I lay in my bed this morning, I got to thinking. I have left home in a good situation and have grasped the weapon of death for the purpose of doing my part in defending and upholding the integrity, laws, and the preservation of my adopted country from a band of contemptible traitors who would, if they can, accomplish their hellish designs, destroy the best and noblest government on earth, merely for the purpose of benefiting themselves on the slave question.
September 21st, 1862. Dear parents, brothers, and sisters, I have been so busy marching and fighting since I came to the regiment that I have not had time to write about anything else. But this pleasant afternoon, I will write something about other things. I will commence with my equipments. My uniform is a pair of light blue pants and dark blue dress coat and cap. I have a haversack to carry grub and a canteen to carry water. Every soldier must have these. Then I have a knapsack to carry clothes, blankets, etc. Besides these, I carry a cartridge box with 40 cartridges, a cap box full of caps, and a bayonet in a scabbard, all on a belt around my waist, supported by a strap over my left shoulder. The cartridge box hangs on the right hip, the cap box in front, and bayonet on the left side. The haversack and canteen hang under the left arm. The knapsack is strapped upon the back. My gun I carry on my shoulder. I have a woolen blanket and a gum one. We have shelter tents. They are made of muslin and in 2 pieces each, about 2 yards square. Each man carries a piece. Button the pieces together, stretch them on our guns, fasten them down with pegs, and we have a house. Our knapsacks serve for pillows. When we don't march or fight, we write letters, read our Bibles, and cook and eat. We get along first rate. Your son and brother, Frederick.
June 1862. My 2 tent mates were wounded, and after that I acted like a madman. I was stronger than I had been before in a month, and a kind of desperation seized me. I snatched a gun from the hands of a man who was shot through the head as he staggered and fell. At other times I would have been horror-struck and could not have moved. But then I jumped over dead men with as little feeling as I would over a log. The feeling that was uppermost in my mind was a desire to kill as many rebels as I could. The loss of comrades maddened me.
Behold the silvery river. In it the splashing horses loitering stop to drink. Behold the brown-faced men, each group, each person, a picture. The negligent rest on the saddles. Some emerge on the opposite bank. Others are just entering the ford. While scarlet and blue and snowy white, the guidon flags flutter gaily in the wind. Walt Whitman.
July 8, 1863. Dear Mother, I telegraphed to you as soon as I could and wrote about Edward. I cannot realize that he is dead. Don't let it kill you, Mother. You and I are all that is left us. Edward was the first man killed in the regiment. There was heavy fighting on the ground, and our forces had possession of the field for a short time. I went out at night to look for Edward, but could not find him. The next morning our line advanced, and I went out to the tree, and there, on his back, his hands peacefully on his breast, lay all that was left of the brother I have lived so closely with all my life. When I got to him, I brought him down under a tree. A captain of one of the batteries said to me, "If he were a brother of mine, I would bury him on the field of glory." He was very kind and sent me men to dig the grave. In a little grove behind the batteries, under an oak tree in his soldier's uniform, wrapped in a shelter tent, lies all the earthly remains of my brother. He has gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord, and Mother, you and I walked this world of sorrow. I set for his headstone a piece of young oak cut off by a rebel shell, and marked his name and regiment. Mother, yet a little time you and I have to walk this earth, when we compare it to the great eternity beyond, where Father and Edward are gone before us. Oh, he was cut down in the very morning of his manhood. He has laid a sacrifice on the altar of liberty. Oh God, thy price for freedom is a dear one. Love, John.
May 20, 1864. Dearest family, let us not be uneasy about what may happen to us here, but put our trust in God. This fighting will last until the war is decided. As long as we live right, we can do our duty without fear. War is a sober thing, and a soldier needs something more than mere courage to support him. Reading the Bible never seemed to afford me so much comfort as it does now. The only pleasant thing here is we have plenty to eat. There is fighting every day. Some of our recruits are not so brave here as they were at home. Your son, Fred.
April 9th, 1865. At 5 this morning we cooked coffee and started forward at 6. We heard very hard cannonading in our front. The cavalry are still driving the Rebs. The cannonading keeps getting further away. At 9 a.m. we halted and had orders to cook coffee. At 11 we again started off and marched pretty fast until 1 this afternoon when we halted, and the talk is that General Lee intends to surrender his army today, which seems too good to be true. At 2:30 p.m. we were ordered to go into camp and that the probabilities are that we have fought our last fight. At 4:30 this afternoon, an officer on horseback, waving his hat and horse-running as if his life depended on his speed, came tearing from the front, yelling the glorious news that General Lee had surrendered the entire army of Northern Virginia to General Grant. Such cheering, shouting, and rejoicing as there was throughout the old Army of the Potomac was never heard or seen in America. The air was literally filled with knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, and everything else the boys could throw into the air. Most of the batteries fired a salute of 30 guns in honor of the glorious victory. Some cried for joy. The rebel army has stacked arms about 2 miles from here at the Appomattox Courthouse. We marched about 10 miles today. The day was fine.
He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is...
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.